All right, my name's Nick Cisco. Today is February 20th, and today I'm going to be taking a look at Substack.com in terms of Ben Schneiderman's user actions and learning more about, uh, basically what Substack does right and wrong in the context of those actions. I actually set aside a rubric here that I created based on those actions that I'll be assessing the website based off of. But first and foremost, we'll just run through the website itself and talk about those user actions and what Substack does right and wrong. For some quick context, Substack is a newsletter platform. Essentially, the goal is to democratize access to basically um, starting newsletters. So if you're like an independent writer, maybe you're really into music or sports or whatever else, you can really quickly spin up a newsletter on Substack and start collecting subscriptions from paid subscribers of your independent newsletter, which is pretty cool. So first, we'll talk about overview, which is basically the concept of making all of the affordances, information, key content of the site that's relevant to the user, making that all front and center so that the user has a full understanding of what information is possible to delve into. And then for, on their own, they can make a decision about which content they're interested in actually diving deeper into. So in terms of overview, Substack, first and foremost, pretty clear is like a very plain website for all intents and purposes. We have a very basic call to action um, that is basically they're working with this marketplace of like we have people wanting to read, we have people wanting to write. So let's I guess target both in the start there. But in terms of overview, let's say that I'm coming on this site to read content. We have a few basic publications listed over here. There isn't much indication about where these come from, why they're here. Oh, well, I guess it looks like they're featured over here. I had to do a little moving my eyes around to see which publications or which categories publications responded to. Um, so I wonder if I change these categories. Okay, that makes sense. So if I change the categories, I can see different publications on the left. In terms of overview, initial takes, this is not a bad system at all. I think there's a little bit of a, trying to realize that these two sections correlated. But with that understanding, actually, this is a pretty simple interface in my opinion. I'm wondering if I click the plus button. Okay, so there's just a few more, which is neat. I would also think in terms of a search bar, that should be probably a little more front and center if I'm thinking about wanting to have an overview of everything I can look at. Um, Wanting to, for example, be able to see a search bar that I have an overview that I could dive into more content outside of just this. But overall, in terms of overview, um, I would be comfortable giving this a fairly high grade, probably in the exemplary category, simply because if I'm a reader, and we'll just put on that mindset here as like someone who's wanting to consume content, it's pretty all encompassing and actually really simple to see everything. A lot of sites try to get really flashy with big images and stuff, but this is pretty easy to see. So next up we'll have zoom, zooming in on items of interest. Pretty easy to do that. I'm assuming, if I just click one of these, okay, interesting. We have a little, it's kind of an interesting order of things. You click on something wanting to get into it, and it's like immediately give us your email. I would imagine there are very, very few people who immediately put their email in. Almost everyone would say, let me read this first. Uh, so I go to Zoom. This is a particular newsletter, it looks like. Um, and yeah, we just have the newsletter and relevant information about it, it seems. I think that's a pretty basic breakdown of how I would Zoom. So yeah, I'm not sure there's much else to say about that. I think through the search bar, probably the same functionality of zooming. So for the zoom category, I'll give this an exemplary simply because I can very easily jump into any piece of content, newsletter wise, I should say, that I'm interested in. I will say it is interesting that Substack chose to go to the level of searching by publication. They could have very well said, let's just like go medium.com style, and anything that's in a newsletter we can just like search for or see like individual newsletter posts very easily. It's clear that their focus is on generating a relationship between a writer and the audience, and therefore they're pushing the whole newsletter itself. I think that's an interesting decision from a business perspective. I still think in terms of zooming that I have full range of motion in doing that essentially. So exemplary on that front. Let's go into the next step, which is actually filtering out information. We kind of already touched on that pretty pretty soundly here. They have a nice little categorization method here. I can kind of filter the content that I want to see. In terms of outside of that, we have a search bar. I'm not sure if there's any functionality in here. Let's try. Um, let's just say like I'm interested in music, like very broad. Discover great things to read. Okay, so we got some music newsletters here. There's no way to filter these outside of seemingly just searching, which is not the most ideal. I would think on a site like this that has just tons and tons and tons and tons of newsletters, we should have some really great filtering functionality on the search bar. But overall, I would say based on the landing page and on this, in terms of filtering, I still want to give it a higher grade simply because it is really easy to break down content by category or by topic, as they call them. Outside of that, though, not a ton of filtering options. See, I'm trying to think if there's any other methods I'd want to even filter by other than topic. I'd be comfortable, honestly, like anywhere between a 3 and a 4 based on my rubric. We'll go ahead and give it a 4 just because I can't even think on the top of my head how else I'd want to filter a newsletter by. Maybe if this was something in retail, there'd be a lot more things that I'd want to filter by, but we'll go ahead and call this acceptable and give it an exemplary for filtering, just because it like everything I could possibly think of wanting to filter by is clearly available. So we'll move on to details on demand. So details on demand, at first I was a little confused, honestly, about the difference between this and zooming. In my mind, zooming is more of actually being able to focus in on particular content, whereas details on demand is actually seeing more detail for a given piece of content rather than just like the action of being able to focus in on it. So in terms of seeing more detail, that was interesting. So I went into this page after I'd already the first time went into it, and this time it didn't ask me for my email immediately. It just took me straight to the newsletter. But in terms of seeing detail, I wonder if I can. So, for example, if I'm, the first time coming onto this, I might want to see just like details about the newsletter. Trying to figure out, like, can I click up here? That would take me back there, I'm assuming. Okay, so I click on that tiny little text of the author, and it gives me a little profile on him. I'm a little confused now of like the relationship between newsletter and profile. Like, is this any of this guy's newsletters here? I'm gonna go back to the newsletter. In terms of seeing details about the newsletter, I would have imagined more of a is this an article? Is this like information about the newsletter itself? I'm trying to find details about the newsletter to decide if I want to subscribe. Like, what's this newsletter about? How do I find more information about it? They are very much pushing the content of the newsletter first and foremost, but not like just some general information about like what is this newsletter about. And I'm obviously scanning like a user would. I'm trying to figure out from this, like, is this a particular post, or is this okay? Yeah, so this is actually this is what this newsletter is about, and it is not something that is very scannable, and so technically the details are here. In terms of the intuitiveness and simplicity of finding details about a particular newsletter, for example, I'm not as impressed on that front, just because it's kind of clouded and not clear, especially because, you look at this, like this could have very well been a featured article. The font here of the header is the exact same as all this other, these are seemingly posts to the newsletter. So In terms of details on demand, I'm going to give this a 2, simply because most of the details, like I said, are present in terms of if I'm trying to decide whether to do the main call to action of this entire platform, which is to subscribe to a newsletter. But it does take some effort, admittedly, to actually find that information, more so than I would have thought that it would. So I'll give that one a 2. So in terms of relationships, this is an interesting one because essentially, this is a marketplace product. We have individual newsletters that are related only basically by topic, or they have a different naming conventions everywhere. We have categories, and then they're also called topics on a different page. Anyway, but that's seemingly the only connection between them. Uh, in terms of relationship, that's a clear relationship. I don't know if I can even think of other relationships that I would want to see, or between information that I want to see. Uh, it's pretty clear when I go to a particular newsletter that all of the content is of the newsletter. So the relationship between the content is pretty clear. If I click on a specific newsletter, let's just scroll to the bottom. Okay, with references. Yeah, so it's more of this particular newsletter. So it's pretty clear once you get, and I mean, look at the URL. It's like I am at this newsletter's particular domain. So I would say relationship between content. I have no complaints about. I can't think of anything else that I would want particular information for. I also think it's really interesting. This is just kind of a tangent, but on the main page, you have a search bar where you can search by newsletters. When I go to a particular Substack, a particular newsletter, that whole search thing is gone, and I am like, it is like I'm on a website for the Substack. I don't search for other Substacks. I'm not recommended other Substacks. I am on the Georgia COVID-19 updates, and that is all. And so I'm wondering, actually, if I click about. Okay, so there's another, going back to details on demand, another way that I just completely missed how to get details about the newsletter. Wouldn't have assumed to click the caret. I would have assumed to just go to the main page and see it. But in terms of relationships, I'll give it an exemplary just because no other relationships I could really think of that this doesn't cover. So in terms of history, I've actually been thinking about this one sort of passively as I've interacted with this website. It is extremely annoying to figure out how to get back to things. Like I was trying to figure out how to go back to the home page of Substack. And okay, so if I click back button enough, I can get there. But once I'm on a newsletter page, and let's say I'm like a few articles in, like there's no like Substack logo, for example, to take me back to the main page to look at other newsletters. And so a very common use case would be I'm on this main page or I'm searching for newsletters. I go into one, I look at an article or two, maybe decide that I don't like it. And then it's like, okay, well, maybe I want to go look at other ones. But at this point, I like don't know. I don't know how to do that at all. I mean, I would probably be the kind of person that would go back to Substack.com manually because I don't know how to go back. In terms of history, I would say on the newsletter level, it seems pretty intuitive to find, to be able to trace your steps back and see content in that way. But at the broader website level, it's a little disappointing to try to figure out how to do that. So I'll go ahead and give it a 2, just based on the fact that it's difficult to navigate when you're just looking for different newsletters, which seems to be a very important thing that they would want to allow for. Okay, so finally is extracting, which in the context of something like this, in my mind, would be a lot of like sharing to social media. If I find a newsletter I like, find an article I like, let's go ahead and just pick a newsletter about chairs, design, and other things. Maybe I'll subscribe to this one. So wait for that to load. Again, don't know why I would ever put in my email out front there. So right off the bat, we see I don't even have to read an article, and I immediately have a share sheet that I can do anything with. Wondering if I do, imagine that would do like a mail to link. Like let's say I did Facebook. Okay, yeah. So those all link out, probably very easy to share from there. Twitter, Substack actually is linked to your Twitter account, so I'd imagine that's a pretty direct connection. And then yeah, I can copy a link and share it with anyone without even having to go into an article. Once I'm in it, the exact same iconography there for that. Let's say I just read the whole article, another option to share when I got to the bottom of the article. Um, in every single preview of an article, I can share if I want to. So, oh, so is this the about page for this one? Yeah, so I just completely missed that in details. Um, again, would have thought this was at the top of the page, but yeah, in terms of extracting everything I could possibly want, the only thing I could think of is maybe I'd want to share like the whole newsletter. Like if I'm just on this newsletter, I'm like, hey, I want to send this to a friend. It's a really cool newsletter. I would probably have to manually copy this link myself. Not hard to do, but maybe it'd be nice if I could share the whole newsletter. Um, yeah, I'll go ahead and give it an exemplary because for all intents and purposes, everything I could think of wanting to share for the most part, I can share. And that's it. That's user action analysis based on Ben Shneiderman's user actions of Substack.com. Overall, pretty impressed. There were a couple weird things with like history, finding details that were annoying, and I think their challenges mostly like right now. I'm trying to figure out how to get back to Substack.com. I think those are mostly just artifacts of this being a marketplace product, where Substack has to balance, uh, you know, sharing their own business while also sharing, uh, you know, the content itself. I'm just curious when I go to the right page, it looks like a separate landing page for learning how to write with all kinds of call to action buttons. Cool. Well, that was an analysis and of Substack.com, and thanks for watching. So have a good one.